In the Bible, there's a part in Genesis where God basically tells Adam and Eve, if you take part of this fruit, you will surely die. And in that, God wasn't necessarily talking about a physical death, even though we are going to physically die one day. He was talking about spiritual death. And I think that is so key because, of course, ultimately you see them sin and ultimately they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. But, that decision introduces sin into the world. And that sin is ultimately what kills us spiritually, your separation from God. And that's what God's talking about in that sense. And I think that's very more key. And it really, you kind of see the ramifications of that in society today. Ultimately, we are consumed by sin. And that sin really detracts us from God and also makes our life way more arduous than it needs to be. God knows us. He knows what's best for us. But due to sin, and I really don't think we take enough consideration into how smart Satan is. He knows us. He appeals to all of our senses, and he's so tactful. And when his sin but reaches us and gets us, and ultimately it leads us closer from to him and farther away from God. And I think that's so key. If you guys look at the Old Testament, you know, when Jesus was trying to kind of reconcile his relationship with man, he really usually talked to one person, really, and then they gave ordinance to everybody. But basically in the Old Testament, they had what would you call a very strict instruction. If you didn't live by that instruction, you would die. For example, Aaron and his sons, God instructed Aaron's sons to give a certain sacrifice. They didn't do that and they ended up getting burned. I believe also in the Old Testament, and don't quote me on this, but there was an instance where the prophet, he was bald and he was made fun of by kids. God sent a bear and attacked those kids and killed those kids. So you see how God's very strict in that, but ultimately God knew he can live under the Old Testament. We would die under that Old Testament. I know I would. I know we did because we sin every day. It's just a part of society in the world. So ultimately Jesus came down and through his sacrifice, which God did, because he was a perfect lamb. He was of God. He's blameless. We're not. Ultimately, through his sacrifice and his shedding the blood, now we have the opportunity to be saved and to be forgiven of our sins and not die. We're given a second chance if we live under God, if we follow the Church of Christ, do what God's called us to do. So I think that just this is something I just had in my mind today, and I think that kind of like shows you like we're forever indebted into sin. That's this world, but if we follow Jesus, do what we're supposed to do, then maybe hopefully we can be able to go to heaven, but also we can get closer to God and track from sin. Thank you, and have a great day.